Surviving Ancient Rome, a modern person's guide to Roman eating habits and social dining. Introduction. Welcome to your Roman culinary adventure. Imagine stepping through a time portal and finding yourself standing in the bustling streets of ancient Rome during the height of the empire, around 100 AD. The first thing that would assault your senses wouldn't be the sight of the Colosseum or the Forum, but rather the overwhelming mixture of aromas wafting through the air. The smell of fermented fish sauce, roasting meat, fresh bread, and spices from the far corners of the empire would create an olfactory experience unlike anything you've encountered in your modern life. As a time traveler from the 21st century, your survival in ancient Rome would depend heavily on understanding not just what Romans ate, but how they ate, when they ate, and most importantly, what your social status would allow you to eat. The Roman dining experience was a complex social hierarchy expressed through food, where your meal could determine your place in society, and your place in society could determine your meal. The question isn't simply whether you could survive on Roman food, but whether you could navigate the intricate social customs, adapt to completely different flavors and textures, and stomach some of the more unusual delicacies that Romans considered normal parts of their diet. From the luxurious banquets of the wealthy elite to the simple porridge of the urban poor, Roman eating habits reveal a civilization both sophisticated and strange, familiar yet foreign to our modern palates. Before we dive into the specific diets of different social classes, it's important to understand that Roman cuisine was fundamentally different from what we consider Italian food today. There were no tomatoes, no potatoes, no pasta as we know it, and certainly no pizza. Instead, Romans built their cuisine around grains, legumes, olive oil, wine, and a bewildering array of sauces and seasonings that would challenge even the most adventurous modern foodie. The Roman meal structure, a day in ancient Rome. Your first challenge as a modern person in ancient Rome would be adjusting to the Roman meal schedule, which was dramatically different from our contemporary 3 meals a day pattern. Romans typically ate only one substantial meal per day, called the cena, which took place in the late afternoon or early evening. This was preceded by a light breakfast called ientaculum, and sometimes a small lunch called prandium. The ientaculum was often nothing more than bread dipped in wine, water, or milk, sometimes accompanied by honey, cheese, or olives. As a modern person accustomed to substantial breakfasts, you might find yourself struggling with hunger pangs throughout the morning. The Roman approach to breakfast was purely functional, designed to provide just enough energy to start the day without weighing down the stomach. The prandium, when it was eaten at all, consisted of cold leftovers from the previous evening's dinner, or simple fare like bread, cheese, and perhaps some fruit. Many Romans, particularly those of the working classes, would skip this meal entirely, relying instead on street food purchased from vendors throughout the city. The main event of the Roman day was the cena, which could last for hours and involved multiple courses. However, the complexity and duration of this meal varied dramatically based on social class. For the wealthy, dinner was a social event, a display of status and an opportunity for political networking. For the poor, it was often a simple bowl of porridge or gruel consumed quickly before returning to work or sleep. The wealthy elite, dining as performance art. If you found yourself among the Roman elite, either through birth, wealth, or political connection, you would experience some of the most elaborate and exotic dining customs in human history. Roman banquets, or convivia, were theatrical performances where food was just one element of a carefully orchestrated display of wealth, culture, and social status. The wealthy Romans' dining room, called the triclinium, was designed specifically for reclining while eating. As a modern person, you would need to master the art of eating while lying on your side, propped up on your left elbow, using only your right hand. This position, which Romans considered civilized and sophisticated, would likely leave you with a sore back and spilled food until you developed the necessary skills. The food served at elite Roman banquets would both fascinate and horrify modern sensibilities. Romans had no concept of separating sweet and savory flavors, and meals often featured bizarre combinations that would challenge your taste buds. A typical wealthy Roman dinner might begin with gustaicio, or appetizers, which could include items like honeyed wine, eggs, olives, and various exotic delicacies. One of the most infamous aspects of wealthy Roman dining was their love of garum, a fermented fish sauce that was used as liberally as we use salt and pepper today. Made from fish entrails left to ferment in the sun for several months, garum had an intensely pungent flavor that Romans found irresistible, but that would likely revolt modern palates. As a time traveler, you'd need to develop a tolerance for this ubiquitous condiment, or risk appearing uncivilized to your Roman hosts. The main courses at elite banquets often featured elaborate preparations of exotic meats. Peacocks were served with their feathers reattached to create the illusion of a living bird. Dormice were considered a particular delicacy, often stuffed with nuts and honey before being roasted. Wild boar was popular, sometimes presented whole and carved at the table in a dramatic display. Perhaps most shocking to modern sensibilities were some of the more unusual protein sources that wealthy Romans enjoyed. Flamingo tongues were considered an exquisite delicacy, as were the wombs of pregnant pigs. Sea urchins, various types of shellfish, and even certain insects were regularly featured at elite tables. The wealthy Romans' love of exotic and unusual foods was driven partly by genuine appreciation, but also by the desire to demonstrate their ability to afford rare and expensive ingredients. The Romans also had a fascination with dishes that weren't what they appeared to be. A skilled Roman chef might create a fish that was actually made from minced pork, or vegetables that were actually crafted from various meats. These culinary illusions were considered the height of sophistication and would require you to suspend your expectations about food entirely. Seasoning in wealthy Roman households was complex and often overwhelming by modern standards. In addition to garum, Romans used a variety of spices imported from across the empire and beyond. Pepper was so valuable, it was sometimes used as currency. Silphium, a now extinct plant from North Africa, was worth its weight in silver and was used to flavor the most expensive dishes. The drinking culture among the Roman elite would also challenge modern sensibilities. Wine was never consumed pure, but was always mixed with water, often in elaborate rituals involving specific ratios and temperatures. The quality and age of wine served indicated the host's wealth and sophistication. Refusing wine or drinking it incorrectly could mark you as a barbarian. Wealthy Romans also practiced vomitoria, though not in the way popular culture suggests. The term actually referred to exit passages in amphitheaters, but wealthy Romans did sometimes induce vomiting during long banquets to make room for more courses. This practice, while shocking to modern sensibilities, was considered a practical necessity during extended dining sessions that could last 8 hours or more. The middle class, comfort and compromise. If you found yourself among Rome's growing middle class, which included successful merchants, skilled craftsmen, and minor officials, your dining experience would be more familiar to modern expectations, while still presenting unique challenges. The Roman middle class represented a new social phenomenon. People who had risen above subsistence living but hadn't achieved the extreme wealth of the aristocracy. Middle-class Romans typically ate 2 substantial meals per day, a light breakfast and a more substantial dinner. Their breakfast might include bread, cheese, eggs, and sometimes meat or fish. Unlike the wealthy, who often skipped breakfast entirely to save appetite for elaborate dinners, middle-class Romans needed the energy for their daily work and couldn't afford to be weak from hunger. The middle-class Roman kitchen was a far cry from modern conveniences, and as a time traveler, you'd need to adapt to cooking methods that were labor-intensive and time-consuming. Most middle-class homes had small kitchens with basic cooking equipment, including clay pots, bronze pans, and simple ovens. Fuel was expensive, so most cooking was done over small, carefully managed fires. Middle-class Romans had access to a wider variety of foods than the poor, but couldn't afford the exotic delicacies of the wealthy. Their diet centered around bread, which was subsidized by the government and available at reasonable prices. However, the quality of bread available to the middle class was superior to that consumed by the poor, often made with finer flour and sometimes enriched with eggs or honey. Meat was a regular part of the middle class diet, though not in the quantities consumed by the wealthy. Pork was the most common meat, followed by chicken, goat, and beef. Middle-class Romans also had access to various types of fish, both fresh from the Mediterranean and preserved through salting or smoking. The preservation techniques used by Romans were sophisticated, allowing them to enjoy protein sources throughout the year. Vegetables played a larger role in middle-class diets than in wealthy households, where they were often viewed as food for the poor. Middle-class Romans regularly consumed cabbage, turnips, beets, onions, garlic, and various legumes including lentils, chickpeas, and beans. These vegetables were often prepared in stews or soups that could stretch expensive ingredients and provide filling, nutritious meals. The middle class also had access to a variety of fruits, including apples, pears, figs, grapes, and various nuts. Many middle-class families maintained small gardens where they grew herbs and vegetables, supplementing their purchased food with homegrown produce. This agricultural connection would be familiar to modern people who maintain vegetable gardens, though the varieties available would be quite different. Middle-class Romans were also consumers of various dairy products, though these were quite different from modern versions. Cheese was common and came in many varieties, from simple fresh cheeses to aged varieties that could be stored for months. Milk was typically consumed fresh from goats or sheep rather than cows, and the flavor would be distinctly different from modern pasteurized milk. The seasoning preferences of the middle class were simpler than those of the wealthy, but still would challenge modern palates. Garum was still used, though perhaps not as liberally. Herbs like dill, coriander, cumin, and various mints were common. The middle class also used honey as a primary sweetener, as sugar was unknown in the Roman world. Wine remained an important part of middle-class dining, though the quality was lower than what the wealthy consumed. Middle-class Romans typically drank wine diluted with water, and the wine itself was often of local production rather than the expensive imports favoured by the elite. Beer was also consumed, particularly in the northern provinces, though it was generally considered a drink for barbarians by Romans in the Italian peninsula. The dining customs of the middle class were less formal than those of the wealthy, but still followed certain protocols. Meals were social events where family members gathered to share food and conversation. The middle class didn't typically recline while eating, but sat on stools or benches around simple tables. The urban poor, survival, and simplicity. If your time travel adventure placed you among Rome's urban poor, you would face the greatest challenge in terms of food security and nutrition. The urban poor made up the largest portion of Rome's population, including unemployed citizens, freed slaves, and immigrants from across the empire who had come to the capital seeking opportunities. The diet of Rome's urban poor was centered around the cena, the main meal of the day, which for this class typically consisted of a simple porridge or gruel called pulse. This basic dish was made from whatever grains were available, usually wheat, barley, or millet, cooked with water and sometimes flavored with a small amount of olive oil, herbs, or vegetables when available. The Roman government recognized the potential for social unrest among the urban poor and implemented a system of free grain distribution called the annona. Citizens could receive a monthly ration of grain that provided basic sustenance, though the quality was often poor and the quantity limited. As a modern person, you would need to understand this system and ensure you were registered to receive your ration, as it could mean the difference between hunger and survival. Bread was also available to the poor, often subsidized by the government or sold at reduced prices. However, the bread available to the poor was of much lower quality than that consumed by higher social classes. It was typically made from coarse flour that included not just wheat, but also other grains and sometimes even sawdust or other fillers to stretch the ingredients. Protein was scarce in the diet of the urban poor. Meat was generally too expensive, so protein came primarily from legumes like lentils, chickpeas, and beans. Occasionally, the poor might have access to small amounts of fish, particularly cheaper varieties or fish that was beginning to spoil and sold at reduced prices. Eggs were also sometimes available, though they were considered a luxury. The urban poor relied heavily on street food vendors for variety in their diet. These popinets sold prepared foods like sausages, fried fish, hot porridge, and various snacks. The quality of street food was variable, and food safety was a constant concern. As a modern person accustomed to health regulations and refrigeration, you would need to develop a strong stomach and hope for the best when purchasing street food. Vegetables available to the poor were typically the cheapest and most common varieties: cabbage, onions, turnips, and garlic. These were often added to the daily porridge to provide flavor and additional nutrition. Wild plants and herbs gathered from areas around the city also supplemented the diet of the poor, requiring knowledge of which plants were safe to eat. The poor had limited access to cooking facilities, as many lived in crowded apartment buildings called insulae that lacked individual kitchens. This meant that most food had to be purchased already prepared or cooked over small braziers in shared spaces. The risk of fire was constant, and many of the poor relied on communal cooking areas or street vendors for hot food. Water quality was a major concern for the urban poor. While Rome had an excellent aqueduct system, the poor often lived in areas where water quality was questionable. Wine, even cheap wine, was often safer to drink than water, and it was commonly mixed with water to stretch the supply and kill potential pathogens. The eating schedule of the poor was often irregular, depending on work availability and income. Unlike the wealthy, who could afford to skip breakfast and eat elaborate dinners, the poor ate whenever food was available. This might mean a single meal per day during hard times, or small amounts of food throughout the day when circumstances were better. Seasonal variation had a major impact on the diet of the poor. During summer and fall, when fresh foods were more available and cheaper, the poor might enjoy a somewhat more varied diet. Winter months were particularly challenging, as stored foods became more expensive and fresh foods were scarce. Regional variations and provincial differences. Roman eating habits varied significantly across the vast empire, and your experience as a time traveler would depend greatly on which part of the Roman world you found yourself in. The diet described above primarily reflects customs in the city of Rome itself, but provincial dining could be quite different. In the northern provinces like Gaul and Britain, the Roman diet was heavily influenced by local Celtic traditions. Beer was more common than wine, and the local population consumed more meat, particularly beef and pork, than was typical in the Mediterranean regions. Dairy products were also more prominent, with various types of cheese and fermented milk products that would be unfamiliar to Romans from the Italian peninsula. In the eastern provinces, Greek culinary traditions remained strong, and the diet included more fish, olive oil, and various fermented foods. The eastern regions also had access to spices and flavoring agents from trade routes, leading to India and the Far East, creating flavor profiles that were distinct from Roman cuisine in the West. North African provinces contributed significantly to Roman cuisine, particularly in terms of exotic spices and preservation techniques. The famous garum was often produced in North African facilities, and various fermented fish products from this region were highly prized throughout the empire. Egypt provided grain for much of the empire and also contributed unique foods like various types of flatbreads and fermented beverages. The Nile's annual floods created a unique agricultural system that produced foods unfamiliar in other parts of the Roman world. Unusual Roman delicacies that would challenge modern palates. Romans consumed numerous foods that would shock and disgust modern eaters. Understanding these unusual delicacies is crucial for a time traveler hoping to navigate Roman society without causing offense or revealing their foreign origins. Garum, the ubiquitous fermented fish sauce, was just the beginning of Roman food preferences that would challenge modern sensibilities. Romans regularly consumed various animal parts that modern Western cuisine typically discards, including organs, blood, and other offal. These were not just eaten by the poor as cheap protein sources, but were considered delicacies by the wealthy when prepared correctly. Blood sausages were common throughout the Roman world, made from pig or sheep blood mixed with various grains and seasonings. The texture and flavor would be unfamiliar and potentially revolting to modern palates unaccustomed to blood as a food ingredient. Romans also consumed various insects and larvae, particularly in certain regions of the empire. Locusts were prepared in various ways and considered an acceptable protein source. Certain beetle larvae were considered delicacies and were often prepared with honey and spices. The Roman love of fermented foods extended beyond garum to include various fermented meats, vegetables, and dairy products. The fermentation process created flavors and textures that would be completely foreign to modern tastes, accustomed to fresh or simply preserved foods. Certain Roman preparation methods would also challenge modern food safety sensibilities. Meat was often aged in ways that would be considered dangerous by modern standards, and the Romans had a particular fondness for foods that were just beginning to spoil, believing that the slight decomposition enhanced flavor. Seasonal eating and food preservation. Roman eating habits were heavily influenced by seasonal availability, much more so than modern diets that rely on global food distribution and preservation technology. As a time traveler, you would need to adjust to dramatic changes in available foods throughout the year. Spring was a time of fresh vegetables and young animals. Early greens, fresh cheeses, and young goats or lambs provided relief from the preserved foods of winter. However, spring was also often a time of food scarcity, as stored grains from the previous harvest were running low and new crops had not yet matured. Summer brought abundance, but also challenges. Fresh fruits and vegetables were plentiful, but the heat made food preservation difficult. Romans developed sophisticated techniques for drying fruits, vegetables, and meats to preserve the summer abundance for later consumption. Fall was harvest time, when grains were collected and processed for the coming year. This was also the season for making wine and preparing various preserved foods that would sustain the population through winter. Winter was the most challenging time for food security. Romans relied on stored grains, preserved meats, dried fruits, and various pickled vegetables. The wealthy could afford imported foods from warmer climates, but the poor often faced genuine hardship during the coldest months. Roman preservation techniques were sophisticated for their time, but would seem primitive by modern standards. Salt was the primary preservative used to cure meats and preserve fish. Honey was used both as a sweetener and preservative, and various acidic preparations were used to pickle vegetables and other foods. Smoking was another important preservation method, particularly for meats and fish. Romans developed various smoking techniques that not only preserved food, but also imparted distinctive flavors that became integral to Roman cuisine. The social aspects of Roman dining. Roman dining was never just about nutrition. It was a complex social activity that reinforced class distinctions, political relationships, and cultural identity. As a modern person transported to ancient Rome, understanding these social aspects would be crucial for survival and integration. The wealthy Roman banquet was a carefully orchestrated social event where seating arrangements, food service, and conversation topics all followed strict protocols. Guests were seated according to their social status, with the most honored positions reserved for the most important attendees. The host's wealth and sophistication were judged not just by the quality of food served, but by the entertainment provided, the quality of the tableware, and the skill of the servants. Middle-class dining was less formal, but still followed certain social conventions. Family meals were important bonding times, and the ability to provide good food for one's family was a mark of success and respectability. Middle-class Romans often entertained friends and business associates, though on a much smaller scale than the wealthy elite. For the poor, communal eating was often a necessity rather than a choice. Shared cooking facilities and communal dining areas created social bonds among the urban poor, but also reinforced their low social status. The poor were excluded from the elaborate dining customs of the wealthy and had to develop their own food-related social practices. Religion also played a significant role in Roman dining customs. Various religious festivals involved specific foods and dining practices, and Romans regularly made food offerings to their household gods. Understanding these religious aspects of food would be important for a time traveler hoping to blend in with Roman society. Health and nutrition in the Roman diet. From a modern nutritional perspective, Roman diets had both strengths and significant weaknesses that would affect your health as a time traveler. Understanding these nutritional aspects could help you make better food choices and maintain your health in the ancient world. The Roman diet was generally high in carbohydrates from grains and legumes, which provided adequate energy for daily activities. However, the quality of these carbohydrates was often poor, particularly for the lower classes who consumed coarse, poorly processed grains that were difficult to digest and low in essential nutrients. Protein intake varied dramatically by social class. The wealthy consumed adequate protein from meat, fish, and dairy products, though their diet was often excessive in total calories and rich foods. The middle class generally had adequate protein intake, while the poor often suffered from protein deficiency, particularly during times of economic hardship. Vitamin and mineral deficiencies were common across all social classes. The lack of fresh fruits and vegetables in winter months led to scurvy and other vitamin deficiency diseases. The heavy reliance on processed grains often resulted in B vitamin deficiencies, particularly among the urban poor. Food safety was a constant concern in the Roman world. Without refrigeration or modern food safety regulations, foodborne illnesses were common. The Roman love of fermented and partially spoiled foods, while sometimes providing beneficial bacteria, also increased the risk of food poisoning. The Roman drinking water supply, while advanced for its time, was still contaminated by modern standards. Lead pipes used in wealthy households likely caused chronic lead poisoning among the elite, which may have affected their health and behavior in ways that Romans didn't understand. Dental health was generally poor among Romans due to the coarse nature of much of their food and the lack of modern dental care. The wealthy, who consumed more honey and sweet foods, often had severe tooth decay, while the poor suffered from tooth wear due to poorly processed grains that contained sand and grit. Conclusion: could you survive Roman dining? After examining the complex world of Roman eating habits, the question remains: could a modern person survive and thrive in the culinary landscape of ancient Rome? The answer depends on several factors, including your social status, your adaptability to new foods and flavors, and your ability to navigate the complex social customs surrounding Roman dining. If you found yourself among the Roman elite, you would face the challenge of participating in elaborate dining rituals while consuming foods that might revolt your modern sensibilities. The exotic delicacies, unusual flavor combinations, and bizarre preparation methods would require significant mental adjustment. However, the wealthy Roman diet, despite its strangeness, was generally nutritionally adequate and often excessive in calories and variety. As a member of the Roman middle class, you would face fewer culinary challenges, but would still need to adapt to cooking methods, food preservation techniques, and seasonal availability patterns that are foreign to modern experience. The middle-class Roman diet was probably the most similar to modern expectations, while still providing adequate nutrition. Among the urban poor, your survival would depend heavily on your ability to stretch limited resources, find safe sources of food, and maintain health on a restricted diet. The challenges of food security, poor nutrition, and food safety would be constant concerns that could significantly impact your health and well-being. Various religious festivals involved specific foods and dining practices, and Romans regularly made food offerings to their household gods. Understanding these religious aspects of food would be important for a time traveler hoping to blend in with Roman society. Health and nutrition in the Roman diet. From a modern nutritional perspective, Roman diets had both strengths and significant weaknesses that would affect your health as a time traveler. Understanding these nutritional aspects could help you make better food choices and maintain your health in the ancient world. The Roman diet was generally high in carbohydrates from grains and legumes, which provided adequate energy for daily activities. However, the quality of these carbohydrates was often poor, particularly for the lower classes who consumed coarse, poorly processed grains that were difficult to digest and low in essential nutrients. Protein intake varied dramatically by social class. The wealthy consumed adequate protein from meat, fish, and dairy products, though their diet was often excessive in total calories and rich foods. The middle class generally had adequate protein intake, while the poor often suffered from protein deficiency, particularly during times of economic hardship. Vitamin and mineral deficiencies were common across all social classes. The lack of fresh fruits and vegetables in winter months led to scurvy and other vitamin deficiency diseases. The heavy reliance on processed grains often resulted in B vitamin deficiencies, particularly among the urban poor. Food safety was a constant concern in the Roman world. Without refrigeration or modern food safety regulations, foodborne illnesses were common. The Roman love of fermented and partially spoiled foods, while sometimes providing beneficial bacteria, also increased the risk of food poisoning. The Roman drinking water supply, while advanced for its time, was still contaminated by modern standards. Lead pipes used in wealthy households likely caused chronic lead poisoning among the elite, which may have affected their health and behavior in ways that Romans didn't understand. Dental health was generally poor among Romans, due to the coarse nature of much of their food and the lack of modern dental care. The wealthy, who consumed more honey and sweet foods, often had severe tooth decay, while the poor suffered from tooth wear due to poorly processed grains that contained sand and grit. Conclusion: could you survive Roman dining? After examining the complex world of Roman eating habits, the question remains, could a modern person survive and thrive in the culinary landscape of ancient Rome? The answer depends on several factors, including your social status, your adaptability to new foods and flavors, and your ability to navigate the complex social customs surrounding Roman dining. If you found yourself among the Roman elite, you would face the challenge of participating in elaborate dining rituals while consuming foods that might revolt your modern sensibilities. The exotic delicacies, unusual flavor combinations, and bizarre preparation methods would require significant mental adjustment. However, the wealthy Roman diet, despite its strangeness, was generally nutritionally adequate and often excessive in calories and variety. As a member of the Roman middle class, you would face fewer culinary challenges, but would still need to adapt to cooking methods, food preservation techniques, and seasonal availability patterns that are foreign to modern experience. The middle-class Roman diet was probably the most similar to modern expectations, while still providing adequate nutrition. Among the urban poor, your survival would depend heavily on your ability to stretch limited resources, find safe sources of food, and maintain health on a restricted diet. The challenges of food security, poor nutrition, and food safety would be constant concerns that could significantly impact your health and well-being. Regardless of social class, all Romans faced food safety challenges that could be life-threatening. The lack of refrigeration, limited understanding of food safety, and primitive food processing methods created risks that modern people are simply not equipped to handle without significant adjustment and learning. The psychological challenge of adapting to Roman food culture might be the greatest obstacle for a modern time traveler. The flavors, textures, and preparation methods were so different from contemporary cuisine that mental adjustment would be necessary. The social aspects of Roman dining, with their rigid hierarchies and complex customs, would require careful observation and gradual learning to avoid social disaster. However, Romans were generally well fed by the standards of their time, and the variety available, particularly to the wealthy and middle classes, was impressive. The Roman approach to dining as a social activity and the importance placed on hospitality might actually be refreshing to modern people accustomed to fast food and eating alone. Your success as a culinary time traveler in ancient Rome would ultimately depend on your flexibility, your willingness to try new things, and your ability to learn quickly. The Roman world offered both incredible culinary adventures and significant challenges, much like travel to any foreign culture, but magnified by the vast differences in time, technology, and social customs. The Romans were not so different from modern people in their love of good food, social dining, and culinary variety. However, their definition of good food, their social customs, and their available ingredients created a dining experience that would be both fascinating and challenging for any modern visitor to ancient Rome. Survival would be possible, but it would require adaptation, learning, and perhaps most importantly, an adventurous spirit, willing to embrace the strange and wonderful world of Roman cuisine. In the end, your Roman culinary adventure would teach you not just about ancient eating habits, but about the fundamental human relationships between food, society, and survival that transcend time and culture. The experience would forever change your perspective on food, dining, and the social importance of sharing meals with others.